This is a virtual reading of Conspirators, To Each His Own Agenda by Matt Gupta.
Chapter 6. The Citadel. Gilorn did not sleep that night. He was too afraid that someone might set upon him and take him away in the dark. He'd lived in the darkness of the woodland all of his life and knew how life worked for Dacians. So he made no mistake that something lay behind the facade of the capital, and he chose to trust his fear. He rolled over on the mat, looking up at the stone, intricately carved ceiling. He was in the citadel, in the servants' guest quarters. Falthor and his followers had been accommodated similarly, only they had rooms with beds and other furnishings. Ignatius had made no effort to find him a bed, and Falthor had refused to let Gilorn reside in an inn in the city, for fear Ignatius might try to something against them. Gilorn knew that 2 Citadel guardsmen were stationed outside in the corridor and was afraid to make a sound, lest they rush in and impale him on their spears. The image flashed in front of his eyes in the dark. He jerked up, throwing himself into a sitting position. He stood up. His legs had uncomfortably impacted on the floor, and he needed to bring them back to life. The room was plain and empty. It wasn't a sleeping quarter, but a cupboard with a single chair and a lifeless oil lamp on the floor. There was no sound, except for the rushing wind. The strong gales from the morning had disappeared into what had been a light breeze. He'd been used to hearing dogs barking throughout the night, or the squeals of raiders trying to bait people away from the safety of the village. The noises of his village, he reminisced smiling, had been a blessing during his youth, when he had been courting the woman who had become his wife. Their late-night bedding would have been discovered many times over if not for the dogs barking at anything and everything. It felt eerie, and a chill ran up his spine. The city seemed to teeter on absolute silence. He looked to the lamp. It was lifeless, but still slightly warm. He pulled a small piece of flint from his pouch and tiny rock, and began to strike them into the lamp. The candle oil caught fire, and the lamp lit up. He did not feel any new warmth from the lamp, and it did nothing to help his fear. His own shadow terrified him, and he jumped. Suddenly, outside in the corridor, Gilorn heard the footsteps of a man in heavy armor. After several steps, the feet slammed into the floor. A moment later, 2 more feet slammed into the floor as well. He could hear people talking inaudibly through the door, and then the door opened with a loud creaking that reverberated throughout Gilorn's chest. Cameron stood in the doorway with a lit iron torch in his hand. "Can't sleep?" he asked Gilorn. He had none of the concern that Gilorn had about silence, and it cut sharply. Gilorn shook his head. "I knew you wouldn't want to stretch your legs." "Aren't you on duty?" "I'm always on duty." Cameron inclined his head, adjusting his cloak to cover the longsword at his belt. "Only the guardsmen are allowed to patrol the citadel. Come, I would show you the citadel by the moonlight. It is truly a sight to behold." Gilorn was glad at the chance to get away from the disquiet of the room, and he got up immediately. Cameron led him through the corridors. It was entirely different at night. The white marble was now black, the only light coming from Cameron's torch and the torches that were systematically placed along the corridor. The citadel was huge, and they walked for several minutes. Gilorn was glad to be out of the quarters. He breathed in the cold air and savoured it. It was different from the woodland, or maybe it was the altitude, but he loved it. They didn't speak until they had left the citadel and were out in the open air. Gilorn shivered. It was very cold up there, They were almost at the top of the mountain, and frost was starting to form on the grass gardens around them. Cameron let out a satisfied sigh. "I could never live in the deserts of the south," he said. "All that heat getting under my armor. It's the cold that hardens a man." Gilorn smiled. He was unamused and was beginning to slip into a slight depression. "The cold has its ups and downs," he managed. Cameron huffed, amused by Gilorn's sadness. He led Gilorn along the courtyard to a balcony that overlooked the city. He turned on the spot, so they were looking back at the citadel. The building was glowing in the moonlight, a brilliant white light that seemed to stop as soon as it reached the building's boundaries. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Gilorn was silent for a moment. "If only I could bring this back to my lady at home." Cameron laughed out loud. "If you could find a painter who could capture this majesty, I would pay you myself." "Is that a challenge?" "Of course," Cameron raised an eyebrow. "In over 2,000 years, no artisan has been able to depict this beauty. A reward of over 1,000,000 gold has been offered for anyone talented enough to do it. When the first king built it, at the beginning, he commanded it to be rendered and sent to kingdoms around us. But not one kingdom sent word back about how magnificent it was. The king ordered all of the painters to have their thumbs cut off and sent to the far west to live in exile." He let out a bemused grunt. "Seems somewhat excessive." "I'm not sure about the top of it, though," Gilorn said, after a dramatic silence. The top of the citadel seemed to be incomplete. He could see the vague outline of scaffolding. "Indeed," Cameron said, smiling again. "Clever, isn't it?" "I don't understand." "The snow spear," Cameron explained, "was where the banner of the capital flew. But when the last king rode to war, the banner flew at the head of the army. No one could be bothered to climb the tower to make a new one, so the tower was demolished. The city was designed so that if a king of renown wanted to make himself known to history, he could commission the building of something on top of the city, either another level or an archway, or the wall." He gestured behind him, vaguely pointing to the wall out by the villum. "The saviors of the first Exitum built the citadel many years ago. It's been under constant rebuilding since. Now Ignatius is bankrupting the kingdom in rebuilding it to his own design." "Bankrupting?" Gilorn asked in disbelief. Then he thought about how decrepit the bridge city was. "But there is money. General Felthor paid more gold than there were men crossing the bridge. How can the kingdom be bankrupt?" Cameron laughed. "Money is being hoarded, not spent, which is probably why the tower is being built." "What do you mean?" "The tower has no use for the banner of the capital," Cameron said. "Towers are built to defend something or keep something locked away." "Like what?" "All the gold has to go somewhere, unless of course it gets spent on concubines." "Concubines? Really?" "I doubt it," Cameron shrugged. "Whatever the reason, it probably works for Ignatius. But look at the building itself." Gilorn looked, but he couldn't see it. He looked at him helplessly. "The tower is built so that nothing can be built on top of it or around it." He was right. The tower was completely smooth and oddly shaped. It was wide at the bottom, taking up the whole roof of the building. The scaffolding stopped near the top, outlining what appeared to be the makings of a domed roof. "Why is that important?" Gilorn asked. "It means that future generations could never build anything to remember themselves by." Cameron smiled knowingly. "Not without destroying the tower themselves, an illegal action." "Isn't that what Ignatius is doing?" "No." Cameron shook his head, his smile widening. "The tower was in a state of disrepair. The constant selling of land over the past few hundred years had drained the kingdom's wealth, and it broke the tower. Ignatius drained the kingdom of every coin, bribing and threatening every politician in his kingdom. He gathered his wealth and rebuilt the citadel. Now it will be the end of the glory of the White City. You speak very openly when you talk ill of the steward, Gilorn noticed. What's he going to do? Cameron said. My family owns the largest stretch of land in the kingdom, save for the House Sea Ward. My brother sits on the highest seat in the council, and my father is funding much of the reconstruction. I thought you didn't like your family. I don't, Cameron smiled. There was a sudden gust of wind and Cameron's torch blew out. But having a rich family has its advantages. Gilorn smiled in the dark. They were silent, the wind whistling by their ears and their cloaks flying like flags. What will happen tomorrow? What do you mean? At the trial, Gilorn said, uncertainly. The general. Cameron was silent, attempting to understand. Oh, he said, finally realizing. Nothing of import, I should think. But Ignatius said that the general will be tried for treason. Cameron laughed, one which echoed down around the mountain. Come, let us go inside for warmth. They did so, using the light of the citadel for sight. Once inside, they proceeded to the guard hall, where the Citadel guardsmen were in conversation and food. As they opened the door, the hall went silent. It was a small room, designed to seat 50 people. The eyes of the people inside were upon them. Cameron stood impressively in the doorway. Gentlemen, he chorused, have I caught you at a bad time? He glowered menacingly. A guardsman stood up, his armor clinking against the stone floor. He walked over to Cameron so that they were within a spitting distance apart. He glared at Cameron for a long moment. Would you drink from a cup or a tankard? He snarled. I would drink from the barrel, Cameron said darkly. The silence could be cut with a knife. Then you are welcome here with open arms, the guardsman shouted, embracing Cameron like a brother, causing their armor to smash together. Brother, he said, I am surprised your armor still fits. The one good thing about the drill masters of the tower, the guardsman smiled. They keep us fit and strangely thin. Am I missing something? Gilorn said. Probably, a guardsman said in the corner. He downed his drink and let out a long and terrible belch. Nobility is not welcome here, Cameron said. Sit. Drink. We have some salted pork left over from the dinner yesterday, the man who'd faced Cameron said. Eat. We have plenty. Thank you, Gilorn said, as a plate was vaguely thrust into his hands. So you are the Kingslayer, the man said. How is it you come to dine at our table from the far reaches of the woodland's arse? I'm still trying to work that out myself, Gilorn said, weakly. It was when food was being placed before him, admittedly cold, he suddenly realized that he hadn't eaten since he'd been summoned to Felthor's tent outside the bridge. The man laughed and slammed him on the back. Well, if you've been brought here, you must be something special. I am Dervin, captain of the Citadel Guard. I would tell you my father's name, but he's dead. Gilorn said, uncertainly. Sorry? What for? Dervin raised his arms high. He died with a drink in one hand and a woman's tits in the other. The other Citadel guards roared with approval at this and drank. Gilorn stared at them. What's the matter? Dervin said. You look like you've just been stabbed up the arse. I thought that the Citadel guards were meant to be nobility. That's in the past, Cameron said. Here, he stabbed a knife into the table for dramatic effect. Respect is earned when we earn it. He emphasized the final words. It works for the best, another guardsman said. A position of a guardsman is considered a position of shame for the nobility outside. We embrace this concept and force it into the new recruits. Any smart asses do not last long in the Citadel. This made Gilorn genuinely smile. Are all of you so merry? There was another roar of laughter. This wasn't in approval or cheer, but in humour. Wait until you see the Wardens of the Star Dome, Cameron said. They're worse than the Fountain Legion. Well, that's the understatement of the age, Dervin sighed into his tankard. How so? Gilorn asked. The Fountain Legionaries are sworn by oath not to engage in any debauchery at all. No drinking, no exquisite foods, no women. Or men, Cameron muttered. Oh, don't start that again, Dervin rolled his eyes. When Cameron offered no response, he continued. They don't drink with us, so their discipline and grimness don't concern us. The Wardens of the Lunaturum, however, he sighed again and belched in disgust. They're another matter. They're so grim and boring they suck the air from the room. Then I hope I don't spend too much time with them, Gilorn muttered, shaking his head. And you won't, Dervin smiled in relief. They don't do much aside from fight and travel to the far sides of the kingdom. They fight orcs and little else. Does every city have a special order? In another age, Cameron said. Yes. The bridge has the Wardens of the Moon Tower. Sea Ward has the Wardens of the Sea Tower. The capital has us and the Fountain Legion. We used to have the Rangers of the Villum, who patrolled the Villum Wall, but they got replaced with militia units. Why? Dervin let out a vague and disinterested sound. The Rangers of the Villum were very underpaid, so they took up second jobs in farmlands, taking work away from the workforce of the city. Dervin smiled. So they got replaced with militia workers who worked for the lords who own the segments of the wall, instead of working for the city. Does it work? Does it matter? Dervin said. The people aren't rioting anymore, and that's all the lords care about. He stood up, so suddenly it made Gilorn jump. I am to be off. I have the Great Wall Watch in the morning. Try not to lose another toe this time, Cameron embraced him. Let us hope, Dervin said. Enjoy your time without people to boss you around. Yes, indeed, Cameron smiled. Dervin and the other guardsmen left, closing the door behind them. The Great Wall. By my father, Cameron smiled. You're full of questions. Gilorn shrugged. Fine. At the top of the Apennine Mountains is a giant aqueduct wall. It brings fresh water to every city in the kingdom. We guard and patrol it to defend against sabotage or avalanches. Gilorn nodded and began to eat his food. It was delicious, or perhaps he was simply so hungry. After a while, he began to slow. Cameron looked up when he heard Gilorn's knife clatter onto his plate, but he said nothing. He simply began to eat his bread and fiddle with his long rasher of bacon. Eventually, the silence became annoying. We have allies in the Citadel Court, he reassured Gilorn, and Felthor is too powerful and rich to be touched by their punishments. He raised an eyebrow and smiled. And then there's the army at the wall. He winked. And Alistair. Gilorn only heard the last part. You mean the Prince of Sea Ward? Gilorn said. I take it they have a history. Oh yes, Cameron smiled. They trained together in the academy in Sea Ward. They were the closest of friends. They even vowed to join their families in marriage once. I thought the prince's family wants to marry into the steward's family, Gilorn said. Even in the woodland, this news was common knowledge. Yes, Cameron said. Unfortunately, the general has no children, nor will he. Why? Because he has an arrowhead in his manhood. What? Cameron nodded, smugly. How he rides a horse is anyone's guess, but their allegiance doesn't end with friendship. Sea Ward is responsible for the safety of all of the South Kingdom, whereas the armies of the capital only defend the Eastern Bloc. For all of the general's talent, Falthor isn't much of a threat compared to all of the armies of Seaward. Falthor's attempts to change the military power of the East take much of the heat off of the prince. Thus their politics are aligned. So Alistair will do everything in his considerable power to defend us, and he has one of the 5 votes to lay sentence. And the other 4? Decimus, Ignatius himself and Aquila, as the representative of Horseland, my eldest brother as well. Your brother? Yes, Cameron hissed between his teeth, as if the word shouldn't be said. He does what is best for the city, or so he says. But as a soldier, I have made my father proud, and what my father says, my brother does. Is he with us then? He will dramatize the situation, Cameron smiled. My brother does love a show. There is a 6th vote that goes to the council as a whole, in the event that the 4 votes are tied. My brother leads the coalition that hasn't aligned with the leading houses. What he does, they will follow. He's a powerful, if unappreciated, ally. What do you think the punishment will be? A fine if anything, but he needs to be found guilty at least. Cameron was bored with the talk now. They'll probably sully his name amongst the people, force him to make a public apology to the council and army that he started the war against the Golden King without permission, even though the declaration of war was made. The usual politics that matters only to the lords of the council. A beam of light suddenly began to shine through the tiny window. Cameron whispered a countdown under his breath. A cockerel shrieked out loudly. I swear I'm going to kill that bird, he muttered. He summoned Gilorn over to the window. I feel for the men in training. He pointed at a group of shirtless men, all shivering in the cold air. No doubt their log march will begin soon. Gilorn guessed that the log march was a training routine for recruits for the Citadel Guard. As they watched, they saw the men wrestle a block of wood onto their shoulders and began to do laps of the gardens. How many laps must they do? In my day, it was 200, Cameron supped on his cup. But it depends on their trainer. If they drop the log, they will start again, even into the next day if necessary. It comes from the gladiator training regimes. Did you know that? I've never seen a gladiator. Cameron exhaled slowly with audible impatience. Come, try to get some sleep. We have a long morning ahead of us.